My name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project. And on behalf of our friends and partners in the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on this beautiful April day. Just a brief note, if you are not on the PEP mailing list but would like to be, please feel free to stop down afterwards. Happy to put your name on the list. A brief program note also, this Thursday in this very room at 6 p.m., the BEP's next public event will take place. It will be Professor Mayor Cohn of the Economics Department giving the fifth in his year-long series, Understanding the Economy. This one will be entitled The Myth of Homo Economicus, the Myth of Economic Man. And that one is also free and open to the public. You're welcome to attend that one as well. But now to today's event. It's not a secret how polarized we have all become. Half or so of the country seems to generally support the general direction of the current president, giving a spike upwards to the question of whether the country is on the right track or not after 4 years of the Biden and Harris administration. And the other half of the country seems, to me at least, to spend part of every day asking itself a version of the following questions. How bad is it going to get? Are we in a constitutional crisis yet? And if not, will we even know it when we are? Even his supporters, even the president's supporters, acknowledge that much of what is happening in Washington, D.C. these days seems fairly unprecedented. So our speaker today is uniquely positioned to help us through these kinds of questions. Jeff Tulis is a political scientist who taught for over 3 decades at the University of Texas in Austin, where he held appointments in 3 different places: the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Communications, and the law school, and where he won teaching awards at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. He has written many articles and several well-regarded books on American constitutionalism and the American presidency, including the classic work, The Rhetorical Presidency, which one journal described as, quote, one of the 2 or 3 most important and perceptive books written by a political scientist in the 20th century, unquote. Many other things to say about his distinguished career, but let's get right to the business at hand. Without any further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming
Thank you very much, Henry, and thanks to my friend Russ, who was involved in bringing me here. And I haven't met Kelly Palmer yet, but she's been doing staff work that I'd like to thank her as well for arranging this trip. Sometimes in talks like this, when there's been a series and other people have come before it that really are pretty good, I always try to say at the beginning that I hope I can live up to the last person. In this talk, I hope I can live up to the poster. I've just never had such a good one. And it really, as I was thinking, what am I going to say? Is it as good as this poster? Now, to introduce the topic, I want to give you a sense of what the topic means. To introduce the topic, please think back to January 6th, 2021, the famous January 6th, and to several weeks after that. Think about your own reaction, your friends' reaction, the reaction of politicians and news journalists. Most people had initial confusion and wondering if this could actually be what we think we're witnessing, followed by an increasing sense of horror, followed by mounting evidence that this was an actual attempt to violently disrupt the peaceful transfer of power in the United States led by a defeated presidential candidate. Ordinary citizens were appalled. GOP politicians, including some who had supported Trump, said they were appalled. It resulted in the most damning impeachment in American history, the most votes for conviction for an impeachment, though not a conviction, in American history, and a powerful speech by the Senator McConnell, then Majority Leader, who said that Trump would be held accountable eventually by the courts, both civil and criminal. 4 years later, in the run-up to the 2024 election, we find that January 6th, even though it was made an issue in the campaign by Democrats, was not a factor in the 2024 election. We found the court said that Trump couldn't be prosecuted the way McConnell said he could for crimes that were connected to the powers of his office. The former GOP critics who were appalled now were backing Trump and also backing his revision of history. Violent offenders subsequent to the election are now pardoned and actually form a kind of, and the first time in American history, incipient and personal militia for the President of the United States. So the awful, the anti-constitutional, the contemptible have become normalized. By normalizing, I mean that both the subjective and the objective outrages, violations of norms at least and violations of law at most, things that were bad or can be regarded legitimately as awful, that they're no longer thought that, or they're no longer thought about. And the key here, I actually think, is the subjective aspect of it, not the objective one. The fact that people actually thought that this was bad. It's not as if, to be a footnote to Henry's comments, it's not as if half the country thought everything was okay and the other half of the country thought it was bad. A lot of the country, most of the country thought it was bad. And now most of the country either thinks it wasn't or doesn't think it's important if it was. Second example, Trump's longest serving chief of staff and the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during his first term, both of them warned the American people during the campaign that this presidential candidate, Trump, was a fascist. So did some of the world's leading experts on fascism, like Jason Stanley, like Tim Snyder, and like Tim Snyder's wife, Marcy Shore. I don't know if you know that all three of them, who were actually friends and professors at Yale University, are moving to Canada. When pressed, Joe Biden initially called him a semi-fascist, and Vice President Harris, when asked, said he was indeed a fascist, and it was part of the closing message of the Democratic campaign. Now, when Trump won and Harris lost, within days, critics of the Democrats were saying it was a huge mistake to say that Trump was a fascist. And I gotta tell you that when I was writing things at the time, I would get pushback from editors that you can't use that word. It's too scary. It's too inflammatory. It's the kind of epithet that people in normal politics wrongly would throw at the party opposite. And I said, yeah, but this isn't normal politics, and this is a descriptor of what we're actually seeing if you have a capacious and nuanced enough understanding of what fascism looks like the one laid out by a guy named Umberto Eco in a famous classic essay called Fascism, in which he shows, for example, that fascists don't all look alike, but they do bear family resemblances to each other. And in that picture, that's what we have. And how could it be a mistake, as Jen Psaki, who is, I think, the best press secretary, having studied the presidency a long time, that there ever was, but disappointed me and continues to do so, in insisting that this was a huge messaging problem. How can it be a messaging problem if, in fact, it's true? It can only be a messaging problem if one doesn't see the task of leadership as involving actually telling people the truth and bringing them to the truth, and not just trying to find out where people are at and crafting your message to that. And that tendency, by the way, to see where people are at and then craft messages to fit it is another example of what it means to normalize. Now, and normalization, this idea that something this bad isn't this bad, or at least we're going to not look at it, is in fact key to how serious the problem is today. I'm not going to lay out ways and strategies that you can defeat Trumpism or fascism, but I can tell you this: whatever strategy you come up with, it requires as a predicate that you understand the terrain that you're strategizing about, which means you've got to be able to call things what they are and see what's happening. And so that's what the purpose of this talk is. Now, there are some deep background conditions that made possible the processes of normalization, and I'm going to talk about those processes in a minute, but the deep background conditions are important to just touch on, even though I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. And the reason I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them is these deep background conditions were there before, for presidents before Trump. So they're necessary but not sufficient conditions for normalization. So since the mid-20th century, we've had an ongoing process of congressional abdication of its core duties and responsibilities to the president and to the courts. So that things that the Congress had routinely done previously, it no longer does. Ways in which the Congress had stuck up for its own institutional powers and interests in the past, it no longer does. And this predates Trump by a good many decades. Connected to that is the legalization of separation of powers disputes. Those are disputes over what power the president has versus what power the Congress has when they conflict. Those kinds of disputes go all the way back to the beginning of our constitutional history, but it's only since World War II that they have become legalized. The courts previously simply stayed out of it on the grounds that since they involved not partisan decisions per se, but political decisions about how much weight, for example, to give a president's claim for executive privilege, which is to keep things secret, versus how much weight to give Congress's claim that for their own purposes they need the secrets to perform their duties. Well, that's a kind of decision of high politics, and it's not a legal decision per se, and so it was left to the political branches to work out. That has been eroding for 5 decades. Closer in time, going back only a couple decades, is the development of hyperpartisanship. My friend Russ here has written a book on partisanship, which can be a very good thing. Being a member of a political party, sticking up for your party, sticking together with your party. Hyperpartisanship is something different. Hyperpartisanship is sticking up for your party as tribe, even when the other side proposes and concedes to do things that your party says it wants to do in order to gain power by allegedly attempting to defeat them. That kind of hyperpartisanship is actually relatively new. It's not just polarization. Polarization's old. Hyperpartisanship, relatively new. The development of demagoguery, that is the president going over the heads of Congress, direct to the people, and not only just speaking to them commonsensically, trying to tell people what's what, but actually trying to manipulate them by appeals to passion, particularly fear, that's been developing over the course of American history, and particularly since Woodrow Wilson. So all those things are predicates for normalization today. All of them were happening before Trump, but they made Trump possible, even though they didn't make Trump inevitable. They were true for George Bush Jr., for example, and for Obama, but obviously George Bush Jr. and Obama were nothing close to being authoritarian, to say nothing of fascist. So it's Trump's own behavior and leadership innovations that are key to understanding the normalization of politics, the normalization of these kinds of outrageous forms of politics today. To get a sense of this and how significant this is, think about your own experiences with campaigns throughout your lifetime and the ease at which very talented, responsible politicians could be defeated by virtue of having made some sort of gaffe or mistake. I went to college at Bates, and it was a long time ago, but it was when Muskie ran first as vice president and then as a presidential candidate. And Muskie, the sort of Rush Limbaugh or Joe Rogan of the era was Loeb, of the Manchester Union leader. He accused Muskie of saying a derogatory thing about Canadians, which was based on a letter that had been forged, that he published, that was not true, that was made up. And he also claimed that Muskie's wife was a sort of loose woman and alcoholic. And so Muskie's campaign got a flatbed truck, drove it up to the Manchester Union leader. He gave a big speech in which he said this coward, is despicable, and did the kind of thing that people wished Dukakis had done when something was asked about, when he was asked about how he would feel if his wife was killed or raped. And he gave a very lawyerly answer. Muskie didn't. He got very emotional. He said, this is terrible. And it was snowing, and David Broder and others reported that he was so emotional he was crying. The Muskie campaign said it was snow melting. In any event, it was over. It was over. This is a candidate who was compared to Lincoln. It was called Lincoln-esque. It was over. It was over for Howard Dean, who roared. Remember that? It was over for Gary Hart, who had the misfortune or the stupidity to have someone other than his wife on a boat that was named the Monkey Business. It was over for all these people, just for something. Along comes Donald Trump, and he does 1,000 of those things, more than you can count. And he only got stronger. How did that happen? How did that happen? As you remember, the most famous being this tape that was the tape in which he was derogatory and worse about women, in effect admitting to assault, actually. Well, what he did was he added 3 Orwellian techniques to the demagogue's playbook. Technique 1 was to repeat everything over and over again till people got used to it. That's the background of the so-called big lie, by the way, that also comes literally out of Orwell as well as out of Hitler. And that's the idea, if you say it enough, people will eventually start to believe it. Secondly, he proliferated his outrages. So every time you're just focused on one thing, another one comes along, and then another one, which diminishes the significance of any particular one. And then thirdly, he projected his vices onto his foes. So if he were corrupt, he would call Biden or whoever corrupt. He would often sometimes do it before, even preemptively, before he was called that. And those three techniques worked extremely well, not so much to convince everybody that he was good or that he didn't do the things that he did, but convinced enough people that there wasn't that much difference between him and other people, even though there was. So that's why it normalized what was in fact extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary became really normal. Now, what is interesting is that in the interregnum between the end of his first term and the campaign for the second one, when Joe Biden was president, what's interesting is in that period, there came, as you know, a cascade of not rhetoric, but actual testimonies, charges, convictions, and evidence that was extraordinarily damning. Never more damning of any American politician than the amount of evidence that was mustered in that 3 or 4 year period. A truckload of damaging facts, hearings, indictments, convictions, judgments, testimonies. And what's interesting is that that mass of stuff, unpredictably, I mean, I certainly didn't see it coming, affected the public mind in a way very similar to the Orwellian innovations of the first Trump term and campaign, which is to say, there was so much of this stuff, it was proliferating and repeating these outrages, so it was hard to keep up with it, even though it was so bad. And he skillfully did the same thing about projecting. He actually tried to show that all this evidence of, for example, his efforts and the efforts of people working for him to subvert the 2020 election, he said that all that evidence was evidence of a Democratic conspiracy against him. The same evidence. Again, it didn't have the effect necessarily of convincing most Americans that he hadn't done what he did or that he was right. It just sort of evened the playing field in the rhetorical sort of discursive field and in the public mind. The judicial processes paradoxically reinforced normalization. First, the court, as you know, held that the issue of disqualification under the 14th Amendment, which specifies pretty clearly that an attempt at insurrection would disqualify you from being president, the court held that it wasn't their job to make that determination, that was something. They didn't say that he was qualified. They said that it is not our job to make that determination. That's for ordinary voters to determine. Well, once you put it that way, it translates something that is a matter of constitutional verity or not into a matter of partisan contestation, which is what it became, and therefore it diminishes the significance of the problem. And it decided even more strikingly that presidents were immune from any criminal charges for acts that could be connected to their official duties. Now, what is interesting about this is those are the acts that presidents should be most criminally liable for. In other words, the problem with a fascist is not that they do bad things or criminal things, is that they use these instrumentalities of the state to do it. That's the whole point. And so this is a massive, I mean, this is a truly massive mistake by the Supreme Court. It's one that actually has come back to bite them today. Just before I came here, some of you might have been watching the news that that they ordered 9-0 that the Trump administration attempt to facilitate the recovery of this man who had been mistakenly shipped off to this prison in El Salvador, and the dictator of El Salvador was in the White House, and he said he's keeping him, and Trump is basically said that he doesn't care what any court says, that's intruding on the executive's prerogatives with respect to foreign affairs, and he's going to do what he wants. Now, the processes of normalization that I just described were further enhanced by intellectualists and journalists who I earlier referred to as seeking, for example, balanced coverage or adhering to conventions that they were used to adhering to with respect to coverage of ordinary partisan politics. The problem is that when it's not ordinary partisan politics, those conventions not only are inappropriate, but they help further the processes of normalization. Now we're in the second term of Trump 2.0, and we have the same dynamic that I've been describing of this truckload of events and facts that are damning to Trump, objectively speaking, but have this effect of normalization for reasons that are formally similar to the attributes of the Orwellian innovations of demagoguery. But there are some new things, or some slightly unexpected things. One of them is the incredible speed at which we knew a lot of this stuff was happening because they wrote it down in this Project 2025, a lot of it. We did not know two things: the extent to which Elon Musk would be illegally brought into the administration and then given this kind of carte blanche to do what he wants. Even in a legally organized reorganization effort, which we've had in the past, the Brownlow Commission, the Hoover Commission and stuff, the idea is people study agencies and they're given some access at the behest of Congress, give a report back to Congress, and then Congress delegates to the executive some authority to rearrange things. None of that's what's happened, okay? Instead, somebody from the outside is brought in and just told not only to make recommendations, but to actually do things. And as you know, doing things is actually dismantling the administrative state. Fast, really fast. Now, there are massive protests, and I think these are to be welcomed. They're good, all for them. But for the purposes of this talk, the thing to be noted is what's really driving and the protests were successful. There were, as you know, April 5th and all that, because of this guy, Ezra Levin, who's head of Indivisible, very smart guy. He says, we want as many people as we can get, so it's a big tent, which is to mean a lot of people are upset about different things. Whatever you're upset about, come together. As a tactic, it seems fine, but it has this normalization problem, which is the real driver is the tariff issue. Because the tariff issue is affecting people's lives, their 401ks, their businesses, and so forth. The tariff is stupid, but it is arguably legal, unlike everything I've been talking about, most of the things I've been talking about. Because Congress abdicated its responsibility, as I said earlier, they actually formally, through law, delegated to the president the ability to declare emergencies. You can contest whether he declared it properly, but they haven't used their power to actually do that. So under that authority, he went and he's doing all this tariff stuff, and it's affecting people, and it's got people upset, as it should. The problem is that things that are actually much more fascistic are not getting most people upset most of the time. I mean, we're disappearing people off the streets. Disappearing people off the streets, and people are not letting that sink into their brain. when people do let it sink into their brain, the only argument that seems to work is, you know, if it's this person now, maybe next week it'll be you, all right? Well, the real argument is, it is me already. If you are a country that cares about rights, you don't care just about your own rights, you care about the country's commitments to rights, and therefore it should be offensive to you as a fellow citizen when anybody is treated the way we've been seeing people treated. But that's not, in fact, a large, widespread sentiment that's motivating these protests, at least presently. And that's due, as I say, partly because of normalization. Now, I want to close, and I'll turn it over for questions and conversation from you, with one issue to close this out, because it's one that's not being taken seriously. On my way over here, I just read James Carville has an op-ed in the Times, I think, today, in which he's doubling down on his Democrats should do nothing strategy, because things like the tariffs and stuff are going to bother everybody. The premise of that is that you can rely on the things James Carville is good at, which is the normal politics of normal partisan contestation to solve the problem, when that's not the world we are anymore in. And to sort of underscore that, in this very op-ed, James Carville says, some people have said there's not going to be another election, that he's going to serve a third term or run for a third term. He says that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Well, I want to close with the point about why it is going to happen. Now, the first thing is, Trump raised, Carville's point is it was raised by Trump to distract people from tariffs. That's his argument. Trump did raise this issue on his own. He raised it on his own, that he might run for a third term. And he raised it quite some time ago, well before the tariff thing. More recently, he raised it again and said, you know, when I said it before, people said I was joking. I am not joking. And then he said, he's talked to people, and it turns out to be multiple ways to serve a third term. And then finally he said, but you know, I shouldn't really be thinking about that now. There's plenty of time between now and then. He brought it up. He told you that it could be, and he told you all the elements of it. It's interesting this way, where he actually tells you what he's going to do. Now, Trump brought this up. He repeats it. He proliferates the ways that it might happen. Now, most people have focused on the first way that has been discussed that he might serve a third term, which is to exploit a loophole in the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment is the amendment that changed the law that had been in our constitutional law up until Eisenhower, and that had permitted FDR to run and win for four terms. It was known as indefinite re-eligibility, and we had a norm that all presidents before FDR had only served no more than two, because George Washington sort of set it as a model. But the law was you could do more, and a lot of people have focused on that because the 22nd Amendment said we're going to change that. And in response to the FDR issue, Republicans said we don't want to have that anymore, so let's confine it to 2 terms maximum. Now the loophole is this, that it's written that no president shall be elected to more than 2 terms, except if you succeed a president as vice president, and in that case you can have only served as president having been vice president for no more than 2 years. All right. So conceivably you could serve arguably 10 years if you figure that out, according to the amendment. The loophole is it doesn't say no president shall serve more than 2 terms. It says no president shall be elected. That's the purported loophole. And there was some debate about it at the time that this amendment was drafted. And it had to do with things like, well, maybe a former president would be a good candidate for Speaker of the House, who doesn't have to be even a member of the House. And in that case, what would happen, since he's second in line of succession, if, you know, we had president and vice president assassinated or killed, would we want it not to be the case that the Speaker of the House could actually take over? He wouldn't have actually run for office. Things like that. So that was the discussion. But the basic intention was that while FDR, at least according to Democrats, was nowhere near a dictator, some Republicans thought that he was, because he had to do some pushing the boundary things in World War II to get things done, dictatorial type things. What would happen if we got a real dictator? So that was the motive for the 22nd Amendment. Now, I want to make a couple points. One is, Trump is going to push this not because he is going to run as Vance's VP in order to take over, because Vance would resign and he would become president. That's the model. And that's why Carville says that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for two reasons. One, can you imagine Trump running to be second to anybody, even temporarily? And two, if he could get over that hump, he can't trust Vance. And you can't trust Vance. I mean, there's no way. Vance is hungrier than Trump for office. I mean, so Vance wouldn't necessarily give it up. So he's not going to do it, but he's going to continue to talk about doing it. And he's going to continue to talk about the loophole. Why? Distraction, maybe partly, but also because it raises the possibility that he will create doubt in people's minds that the entire 22nd Amendment is really at odds with the Constitution itself, and that he should, in fact, just run. Who is going to stop him? Not this Supreme Court. They already said that they can't judge the qualifications of candidates. He would just run. And if he lost, he would just stay. All right, now that's the prognosis, that's the prediction, if you will. But how do you analyze something like that? It seems to me that one has to go back and think about the original debate that led to indefinite re-eligibility in the first place, and what was the problem that had to be fixed with that original insight. And the original proponent of this and the best defender of it was Alexander Hamilton. He had a number of reasons that he used to justify indefinite re-eligibility, but one of the most interesting and important ones was that without it, you would leave the ordinarily middling ambitious person with a motive to exploit the office for personal gain. Might sell stuff, you know, rent stuff out, do something really low and crude like that. But if you give them scope, more time, maybe you could lift their ambition and make them think, shift from their interest to their fame, since everybody at some level wishes that they could be immortal, and the only way that you could be sure of that is through fame, through doing things that people remember and honor you for, and so forth. So Hamilton has a long argument, has a good argument about that in The Federalist. But Lincoln, in a very short time later, as a very young man, found a very serious flaw in that. Some of you may have read a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum. Anybody ever know this speech? Anyway, he gives this speech in which he diagnoses a lot of problems, but central to it is the problem of ambition in the presidency. And he says, here's the thing. What happens not if you get the middling guy who might want to sell stuff, but you get the really ambitious person who really does want immortality through fame. How is this going to be satisfying to them? He says, you really think that a Caesar would be satisfied with the presidency after people like Hamilton as a founder and Jefferson as a president and Washington as a president did all the good, fun stuff of made the whole thing and built this edifice that we call the American Constitutional Order? What's left for me to do? And a lot of people wrote psychobiographies of Lincoln based on this passage, by the way, because his solution turned out to be a kind of refounding. He wasn't, but what he said would happen was you wouldn't basically get a Lincoln if you got this kind of ambitious person. The way, when they faced up to the fact that they were in an office in which all the good stuff had been done by the people on Mount Rushmore, there's nothing left for me to do except tear it down. Destroy it. Destroy it. Now, Lincoln had in mind that some of the great destroyers of the past wanted to destroy it in order to build something new, but the principal thing was to destroy it first. Now, what you get in Trump is, interestingly, a combination of the middling, crappy ambition of somebody who just wants stuff and sells stuff. Apparently, the little office next to the White House is a merch office. Did you know this? That little one that's next door, it's got merchandise. That's where they sell Bitcoins and they hand out hats and all that sort of stuff. So you've got that guy, but you also have at some level in his brain, I can't be FDR, I can't be Jefferson. What am I going to build like that? Well, he has one idea that he thought might work, which was this whole tariff thing. But basically, and by the way, that's the only idea that he really has had pretty consistently across his career. Most of the other things he has no ideas about. But what he really has seized on is I can tear the whole damn thing down. If you want to know more about that, Russ over here has a book called Ungoverning. But I think he's even going farther than Russ has described in that book. So I think the bottom line here is that I think that one needs to think about the things that I've just talked about as the starting point for disrupting the disruptor, which is the starting point for disrupting this normalizing of the outrageous things that he has done and plans to do. Thank you.
Questions for Jeff Tulis?
Yeah.
Yeah, early in your talk, you talked about the truth, that if people knew the truth, it would change their minds. However, oftentimes when the truth is spoken, it is then lied about by Trump. So how do you feel that more truth will get us over the hump?
Yeah, no, I either misspoke or I didn't say it clearly enough or something. One of the things I was trying to show is how people, even who knew the truth, normalize over time. So it just doubles down on your question. The truth is not good enough. It's not good enough. And so what to do? I'm not exactly sure. That's why I didn't get into sort of tactics and strategy. But among the things that you can think about is, does it require a counterpoint to his techniques? War rooms, hitting back harder and often and more forcefully. I mean, you look at the Senate now, Democrats and Schumer and stuff, they just don't, I mean, except for, Cory Booker, there are a half dozen exceptions, and Bernie and AOC and stuff. But the leadership is like not saying anything, all right? So and maybe you have to come back at him, not necessarily with his techniques, but with a kind of persistence. And I don't know though, but that's one, that's what you think about. Like, how do you cut through the fact that that the truth per se is not enough? Does it have to be repeated? In other words, is what I'm saying. Just as the lies have to be repeated in order to diminish your commitment to the truth. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
About this, about the way in which, just pick up on your concluding comment, looking to Lincoln, that these people, Lincoln calls them the tribe of the,
Lion.
the lion,
Yeah.
the eagle,
Yeah.
these, Napoleon.
Right.
Would they be satisfied,
Right.
being a member of Congress?
Right.
Or even with a, governorship or presidential chair, I think is how it refers to the presidency, like it's a little chair.
Right.
Adding just a little bit of storyline to someone else, the story that someone else started.
Right.
And so the founders started and founded and built up, and you just get to maintain it.
Right.
Does glory go to someone who just maintains the house?
Right.
It goes to the architect who designed and built
Right.
that house. So these great ambitious people are gonna have to tear this thing down. And it is the case that now, in the early, whatever it is, 21st century, we're kind of maintaining this New Deal state, these New Deal programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, the Democratic Party is adding a little bit. We're adding Obamacare to the entitlements we got from the New Deal. We're adding and maintaining and solidifying and shoring up Social Security. And this other, their opponents say, I'm gonna tear it down and do something new, altogether new. Tariffs, altogether new. Close the border after 60 years of more open, immigration. I'm gonna do altogether. We're gonna do something altogether new. And I think in the shadows, and we do say this in our book, install a white Christian nation, substitute a white, Christian nationalism for the liberal internationalism of the New Deal. And I'm just curious, when you think about the opposition, and this is, what do you do to oppose this? Can you oppose this with just, we're gonna add some story to the old story, we're just gonna maintain? Or do the opponents also have to be terrorists? Do they also have to, ramp up what they're promising, offer something disruptive and exciting and innovative and new? Do they have to be founders too, but maybe not as dark or as unfree or as dangerous even?
So when I said that he wants to tear things down, I was talking about his motivation. I was not actually talking about my sense that even most of his supporters want it. So when you read our friends in your department and others who study real sort of quantitative political science stuff, they would tell you, as do the tacticians for the parties, that the elections were decided on things like that the eggs cost too much, all right, and that inflation wasn't brought down enough. These were not tear it down ideas. These were like, my life is not as good as I want it to be. The fact that we had apparently the envy of the world economy. I heard it over and over. We had the envy of the world economy, but it wasn't felt that way by a lot of ordinary citizens. And well, that has nothing to do with the motivations of the aspirants. That has to do with, so no, they don't necessarily need somebody to tear things down. They don't necessarily need somebody to have a massive vision. They do need somebody that they're confident is going to make life work and work better in ways that they care about, which is really not, quite a distance from either the utopianism or the dystopianism of these two projects. Yeah.
You were talking about the predicates that make normalization possible. You didn't mention the advent of social media and the rise of conservative.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, that'd be good to add to it. I think that that's true. I think that is true. I also didn't, I mean, I touched on it toward the end, but I didn't highlight that the Federalists who prevailed on this insisted that we think about rights as protected by institutions and politics, and not, as the Anti-Federalists had said needed to be the case, through the inculcation of virtue, which is teaching people to be good, not good for its own sake, like the ancients or the medieval thinkers thought, but in a modern way, good to care about rights. And in the anti-federal conception, and there, for example, we're responsible for, people say, the Bill of Rights, but they didn't have in mind the Bill of Rights tacked on at the end. They had in mind the Bill of Rights at the beginning of the Constitution, that we be more like a creed or a credo than a set of claims by individuals. So the Anti-Federalists had this idea of rights that we all care about for everybody, even though they're obviously individual rights, but we care about them and think about them, and that, as I was setting in the talk, collectively. They did not prevail, and so that the more individualistic notion did, and I think that is a predicate I also forgot to actually mention among the list, but yours are good too. The change in social media, and particularly some kinds of social media, like the former Twitter, has the effect of actually changing the form of political discourse and changing argument into assertion, for example. It has that effect. If you can only speak in short bits, and if you're encouraged to say insults rather than to make arguments and all that sort of thing. Definitely, you're absolutely right. That's part of this problem. Yeah.
I like how you were saying that maybe the massive complaints and shame risen like towards Trump has just led to distraction and confusion, and like he's the victim of a Democratic conspiracy. Do you think there would be like one issue or personality trait that we could have like better focused on to, I don't know, tarnish the campaign or tarnish his reputation? Sorry, that's like pretty aggressive, but.
Here's a perverse way of a hopeful take on your question. So Russ asked me to do this because right after the election, I wrote an essay that was published in something called Democracy Seminar, called Why We Should Be Alarmed, in which I talked about this normalization stuff and the fact that people were uncomfortable with the fascism thing. Anyway, I ended that essay, which was right at the point at which, just week or two or three after the election was over, in which there was a kind of profound trauma experienced by a lot of us and a lot of people in the United States, but particularly college students. And so at the end of this essay, I have a colloquy with a colleague of mine who I like at Texas, who writes a letter to his students and who are traumatized, and says, don't worry, because, we got another election coming up and we're going to fight back, and American people are good. And I said, I disagree. My message to the students is worry. We might not have an election come up. And if we do have an election come up, like, for example, there will be one in 2026, but is it going to be, and the reason for that is he can't threaten a primary people, which is one of his sticks if there's no election. So there's going to be an election, but is it going to be conducted by the usual rules? Well, not if this executive order that he did on elections takes effect. So elections might be different or they might not happen. And so things are really bad. What is the hopeful sign in all that? This is what I said. The trauma that students that I knew and the trauma that my friends' students were experiencing was actually testimony to the education that they got. So despite the fact that my friend, his name is Rod Hart, was much more optimistic than I am, he's a good teacher. I mean, he's really good. So if you take a course from him, you're well informed. So his students were well informed and therefore traumatized, okay? So so a lot of, I didn't talk about this in the normalization thing because I don't want to sound like I'm dissing my fellow Americans or sound like Hillary Clinton and call people deplorable or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, many Americans, often for good reason, because they're working, they have things to do, are not well informed. And so one of the answers is that, because, so, and the reason it's a response to your question is I really don't think there needs to be one thing. If you were a student in Russ's classes or in my friend Rod's classes or other classes, you knew enough to know what was happening. Most people aren't in those situations. Most people turn on the news enough to know that they don't want to hear any more news, okay? They don't want to hear any more. I'm married to somebody like that. She reads the news, but she can't listen to it. Yeah.
Is it an information issue or just a cultural problem with American infatuation with celebrities? One of the reasons Teflon Trump is such that the expectation of the last 100 years of politicians is they're lawyers and they have certain decorum. It's an expectation for accountants and how they behave, and lawyers. He's a celebrity, and there's no bar in terms of people's expectations of how they should perform. So I hate to say it, but isn't it really a cultural issue where our obsession with celebrities has made Trump the ultimate candidate, and the Democrats have to go to the Oprah celebrity group to combat that?
Maybe. I mean, we've been there before and it didn't have this consequence. I mean, whether you liked Reagan or not, for your partisan reasons. Well, yeah, but even before that, all right? But he was in B movies. But he was a celebrity in B movies. And he worked in celebrity circles and all that. Then we had the other guy, governor of Schwarzenegger, celebrity. Whether you liked his policies or politics, they're not anything close to authoritarian-leaning, anti-constitutional, or none of that, all right? They cared about their country. They had their own vision of what it should be like. They tried to follow the law. They would respond to a court order if it was given, all those things, right? So.
Jeff, we're going to let the students go,
All right.
but take one more question.
Okay.
And then we'll they have to go eat and things like that. And if people want to come up and ask something after, we'll let them. So one more.
Go ahead.
So, supposing Trump's economic policies really cause serious pain for a lot of people, in a normal environment, we would hope that the midterms would prove that people were upset and an election. So how would a fascist regime, assuming the economy gets really bad and the pain is widespread, how would they deal with it? Would they eliminate data so that even though you pay more for eggs, there's no national statistics anymore on inflation? That's what Argentina did, or other things. And so they try to convince you, no, things are well, even when you know personally they are not. Or do you move more towards denying that there should be an election?
I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the most likely thing for this 2026 case would be there will be an election. But when you hear him always protest how rigged elections are, you should be wondering, where does he get that idea from? Because he's thinking it. Not necessarily in the mechanisms that he accuses others of doing, but literally in the ways that he's been quite open about. The latest one is requiring certain kinds of IDs to. So if you're a married woman who has taken your husband's name and you didn't get your birth certificate changed to reflect that, you won't be, if this holds, you won't be able to vote. Well, that's now I don't know how that cuts, because I don't know if more married women who have their husband's name are Republican or Democrat and all that. But it's definitely an attempt to rejigger the electoral landscape in order to make it more likely that Republicans would win in their view. And that they have a whole series of efforts that they're mounting on this. And of course, there are organizations opposing them. This guy, Mark Elias, leads a lot of these efforts and stuff. But, and maybe Mark Elias will be successful, but you've got the President of the United States putting the full force of the government behind these efforts to actually reshape state electoral rules, by the way. Republicans used to be, you know, for federalism and all that, but not now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right.